A valley buried under 8 feet of snow. West Virginia, 1884. The Allegheny Mountains had swallowed everyone's, all except one place. High on a frozen ridge, smoke rose from where no one expected anyone to.
She stood at the entrance now, eyes locked on something below. A farmhouse chimney, the one that had never gone cold in 30 years.
No smoke, no light, no movement. The people inside that house. Now they were freezing in their own kitchen, burning chair legs to stay alive.
If you have ever been given something meant to end you, then watched it become the reason you survived, stay with this story. The snow did not begin gently. It arrived before dawn in thick sheets, striking the log wall like handfuls of thrown gravel. Maren Pruitt was already awake when the first heavy gust hit. She did not rise in panic. She lay still on the flat stone she had warmed the night before, listening. Wind against wood, snow driving sideways, the steady breath of fire coals glowing outside the entrance. She pressed her palm against the limestone beside her. It held its quiet warmth. That was enough. 3 months earlier, she had owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a sewing needle worn thin from years of factory work, a cooking pot with a dented rim. She had buried a husband she barely knew. She had stood in a farmhouse kitchen where she was no longer welcome, watching the woman who wanted her gone fold napkins with deliberate calm. 3 months earlier, the world had offered Maren Pruitt a hole in a hillside, expecting her to crawl inside it, suffer, then leave. She had crawled inside. She had not left. But that part comes later. To understand the cave, you first have to understand the woman who refused to die in it. Maren Pruitt arrived in the world the way some people arrive at train stations without anyone waiting. Born in Stonington, Connecticut, in 1855, to a mother who bled out on the delivery table, she never learned her father's name. The midwife wrapped her in a flour sack, carried her to the Sisters of Charity orphanage on Water Street. The sisters raised 19 children that year. Maren was the quietest, not shy, watchful. She learned early that the children who cried loudest received attention first, but attention in an orphanage was not always the kind worth having. She learned to observe before acting, to measure before speaking. These habits would save her life 30 years later on a frozen hillside in West Virginia. But in Stonington, they simply made her invisible. At 14, she left the orphanage for the Halcott and Beale textile mill on the east side of town. The work was brutal, 12 hours at the loom, 6 days a week. Lint filled her lungs until she coughed through the night. Her fingers grew calloused in patterns that matched the weave of the cloth she produced: wool sarge, cotton twill, the occasional bolt of linen for summer dresses she would never wear. She slept in a dormitory with 31 other women, their cots arranged in rows so tight she could feel the heat of the girl beside her through the blanket. She did not complain, not because she lacked the words, but because complaint required an audience, someone who cared enough to listen. Maren had no such person. What she had instead was skill. By 18, she could cut fabric by touch alone. By 20, she ran repairs on the mill's older looms, tightening heddles, replacing shuttles, reading the machine's rhythm the way a doctor reads a pulse. The foreman noticed. He did not promote her. Women were not promoted at Halcott and Beale, but he moved her to the mending station, where the pay was a half-cent better per hour. She took it without thanks. Gratitude, like complaint, required someone worth performing for. 10 years she spent inside that mill. She saved what she could. Not much. A few dollars folded into the lining of her coat, hidden from the other women who borrowed without asking. She did not dream of escape. Dreaming was a luxury built on the assumption that somewhere better existed. Maren had no evidence of that. The letter changed everything. It arrived in March of 1881, forwarded from the orphanage, which still received her mail because she had never lived anywhere with a proper address. A man named Josiah Telford, writing from Kettle Creek, West Virginia, sought a wife. The letter was plain. No poetry, no promises of grand living. He described his farm, 80 acres of hill country, a house with a stone chimney, 2 milk cows, a creek that ran clear except during spring floods. He described himself with similar economy: 26, strong back, quiet disposition, not much for conversation but steady in his habits. He mentioned his brother Rufus, who owned the larger farm next door. He mentioned the valley, how green it turned in May, how the mountains held the fog in their lap until mid-morning. He did not mention love, he mentioned need. Maren read the letter twice. She looked around the dormitory. 31 cots, 31 women growing old in place, their lungs filling slowly with fiber, their hands curling inward like dying leaves. She folded the letter, placed it inside her coat lining beside the money, walked to the foreman's station the next morning, collected her final wages. She did not say goodbye. She boarded a train that afternoon. The journey from Connecticut to West Virginia took 2 days by rail, then half a day by coach, then 3 hours on foot because the coach did not go as far as Kettle Creek. She arrived in April with mud on her boots, her single trunk balanced on one shoulder, her sewing kit in her coat pocket. Josiah Telford met her at the post road. He was taller than she expected. Thin in the way men are thin when they work more than they eat, not unhealthy, just pared down to function. His eyes were brown, set deep beneath a brow that seemed permanently furrowed, not from anger but from squinting into weather. He took her trunk without asking. He walked ahead of her on the path, his stride long enough that she had to quicken her pace to keep up. He did not slow down. He did not look back to check if she followed. She followed anyway. They married 4 days later in a ceremony so brief the minister appeared mildly embarrassed. Rufus Telford stood as witness, a broad man with gray threading his beard, his jaw set in a line that suggested permanent disapproval. Beside him, his wife Ida held her hands clasped at her waist, her smile precise, measured, the kind of smile people wear when they wish to appear generous without actually being so. Maren noticed. She always noticed. The marriage was not unhappy. That distinction matters. It was not warm either. Josiah was exactly what his letter promised, steady, quiet, strong in his back. He rose before dawn, worked until the light failed, ate supper with his elbows on the table, fell asleep in his chair by the fire most evenings. He did not ask about her past. She did not offer it. They moved through the small farmhouse, like two people sharing a boat, aware of each other's weight, careful not to capsize, never quite touching. She cooked. She mended his clothes. She learned to feed chickens, to split kindling, to read the sky for rain. He taught her how to swing an axe, how to notch a log so it sat flush against another. These lessons came without conversation. He demonstrated. She copied. Repetition replaced instruction. The valley regarded her with polite distance. She was an outsider, a mill girl from Connecticut who had never milked a cow, whose accent sat oddly against the soft Appalachian vowels of Kettle Creek. Women at the general store nodded when she entered, then resumed their conversations at a lower volume. Men tipped their hats on the road but did not stop to talk. Ida Telford invited her to Sunday dinner twice in the first month, then once, then not at all. The invitations died the way small courtesies die, not through confrontation but through quiet withdrawal, a slow closing of doors that were never fully open. Josiah coughed that first winter, a wet, persistent sound that rattled through the bedroom wall at night. Maren brewed ginger tea, then mustard plasters, then onion poultices pressed to his chest while he slept. Nothing helped. By January, the cough had settled deep into his lungs. A resident that refused eviction, he worked through it. Men like Josiah did not stop working for something as ordinary as a cough. By February, he had lost 15 pounds. By March, he could not cross the yard without pausing to breathe, his hands on his knees, his face the color of wet ash. He died on April 9th, 1882, a year almost to the day after she arrived. The doctor from Harper's Mill rode out, examined the body, wrote pneumonia on the certificate in handwriting so careless it looked like a word he had written too many times. Maren stood beside the bed, looking down at the man she had married but never quite reached. His face in death held the same expression it held in life, patient, slightly distant, waiting for something that would not come. She reached down, closed his eyes with her thumb, felt the skin already cooling beneath her touch. She did not cry, not because she felt nothing, because grief, for Maren, had always been a private animal, one that moved through her without sound. They buried him on the hill behind the farm, next to his parents, in a plot bordered by fieldstone. Rufus dug the grave himself, his broad shoulders working the shovel in measured strokes. Ida stood at the edge in a black dress that fit too well to be borrowed, her face arranged in sympathy the way a table is arranged for company. After the funeral, they walked back to the farmhouse together. Ida served cold ham, bread with butter. Rufus sat at the head of the table, chewing slowly, his eyes on Marin with an expression she could not quite read. Not hostile, calculating. The calculation took 5 months. Through the summer of 1883, Marin stayed in Josiah's farmhouse, tending the garden he had planted, feeding the chickens he had raised. She paid no rent because no one asked for it, but the silence around her thickened. Rufus stopped visiting. Ida sent word through a neighbor that the church sewing circle met on Thursdays, a detail delivered with the implication that Marin should attend. She attended once. The women smiled their careful smiles, asked where she was from, nodded at Connecticut, as if it were a country they had heard of, but never planned to visit. She did not return. By August, the farmhouse began to feel borrowed. Dishes she had not purchased sat in cabinets she had not built. Tools hung on walls where someone else had driven the nails. Even the light through the windows felt secondhand, filtered through glass Josiah had installed, warming floors Josiah had swept. She was living inside another person's life, wearing it like a coat cut for a different body. She knew, the way animals know weather before it arrives, that the coat was about to be taken back. September 14th, 1883. The day arrived without ceremony. Rufus walked up the path in the late afternoon, Ida a half step behind, both of them dressed in their Sunday clothes on a Wednesday. The formality told Marin everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. She stood on the porch, her hands still dusted with flour from the bread she had been kneading. Rufus stopped at the bottom step. He held a folded paper in his right hand, gripping it the way a man grips something he wants to release quickly. He did not meet her eyes. 5 acres on the north ridge, rocky ground mostly. There's a cave in the hillside, dry enough for shelter until you find something more suitable. His voice was flat, rehearsed. He extended the paper. No one can say we turned you out. Ida stood behind him with her hands folded, her chin slightly raised. Josiah would have wanted you provided for. The words were neat, carefully arranged, carrying just enough warmth to disguise their coldness. What she meant was visible beneath what she spoke. Take this. Leave our house. Disappear up the hill where we do not have to see you. Marin looked at the paper. She looked at Rufus, whose jaw worked slightly, grinding against something, guilt perhaps, or impatience. She looked at Ida, whose smile had not changed since the funeral, that same precise, measured curve that meant nothing at all. She took the paper. She did not read it. She turned, walked back inside the farmhouse, gathered her trunk, her cooking pot, her sewing kit, her 2 blankets. She carried them out the front door, past Rufus, who stepped aside, past Ida, who did not, down the porch steps, across the yard, to the path that led uphill toward Briar Ridge. She did not answer. She did not look back. The climb took 40 minutes. The path, if it could be called, that was a deer trail cutting through scrub oak, blackberry thorns, loose shale that shifted underfoot. Her trunk banged against her hip with every step. Sweat ran down her neck despite the cool September air. The ridge rose above her, dark with hemp, the limestone face of the hillside showing through gaps in the trees like bone beneath skin. She climbed until the path leveled, until the trees opened, until the mouth of the cave appeared. It was wide, too wide, a gap in the hillside perhaps 20 feet across, narrowing as it pushed back into the rock. The ceiling was low at the entrance, maybe 7 feet, rising slightly deeper in. The floor was dry. Rufus had been right about that. Flat stone, mostly limestone, with a layer of dirt accumulated over centuries of wind deposits. The walls were rough, ridged with natural shelves where the rock had eroded unevenly. Water stains marked the ceiling in places, old marks, years dry. Somewhere deep inside, the sound of water dripping faint, rhythmic, patient. Marin set her trunk down. She stood in the center of the cave with her cooking pot in one hand, feeling the air. Not cold, not warm, unchanging. That detail stayed with her. Outside, the September wind blew hard enough to bend the hemlocks. Inside, the air held still. She pressed her palm against the wall. The limestone was cool to the touch, but not cold, a temperature that seemed separate from the weather, independent, self-possessed. She held her hand there for a long time. Something about the stone's refusal to change with the seasons struck her as familiar. She recognized it the way one recognizes a stranger's expression in a crowd, not the person, but the feeling. Steadiness. The quality of holding your temperature when everything around you shifts. She slept that first night on the bare stone floor, her blankets beneath her, her coat pulled over her chest. The wind moved through the cave's wide mouth like an uninvited guest, touching everything, settling nowhere. She did not sleep well, but she did not freeze. In the morning, she stood at the entrance, looked down at the valley below the Telford farmhouse, with its straight chimney smoke, the patchwork of fenced fields, the narrow thread of Kettle Creek catching the early light, then turned her back to all of it. She had work to do. October came with its cold edges, frost on the ground by morning, the last warmth of autumn retreating like a tide. Maren spent the first week studying the cave the way she had once studied looms, observing before touching, reading its patterns before attempting to change them. The mouth faced south-southwest, which meant direct wind from the north would not enter straight on, but would curl around the hillside first, losing some force. The floor sloped gently downward toward the back, where the dripping sound revealed a small seep of groundwater emerging from a crack in the limestone. The water was clean, slightly mineral, cold enough to numb her fingers. She tasted it. Iron, faintly sweet. She could drink this. The shelves in the walls were natural, carved by thousands of years of water moving through soluble rock. Some were wide enough to hold her cooking pot. Others, higher up, could store dried food, keeping it off the floor where moisture might reach. The ceiling, she noticed, darkened toward the back not from smoke but from mineral deposits, a layer of calcium that gleamed faintly when firelight touched it. The cave had its own architecture. She simply needed to learn the language. She began the wall on the third day of October. Trees grew thick on Briar Ridge, hemlock, red oak, hickory. She chose the oaks for their density, their resistance to rot. Each tree took hours. She had Josiah's hot axe, the one he had taught her to swing with her whole body rather than just her arms. Weight forward on the downstroke, let gravity share the labor. She felled the first oak in the late morning, stripped its branches by afternoon, cut the trunk into 8-foot sections before the light failed. Her shoulders burned. Her hands, already calloused from the mill, split in new places, the web between thumb and forefinger, the base of each palm. She wrapped them in strips torn from her spare petticoat, kept working. By the second week she had enough logs to begin stacking. The wall rose across the cave's wide mouth, log upon log, notched at the ends the way Josiah had shown her once when they repaired a fence section. The notches were imperfect. Gaps appeared between logs where the wood curved or tapered. She packed these with moss sphagnum from the damp hollow behind the ridge, carried up in armloads, pressed into every crack with fingers that bled into the green until she could not tell which stains were moss juice, which were blood. A narrow doorway on the left side, just wide enough for her shoulders. A small window opening on the right, which she sealed with oiled paper, a trick she remembered from the orphanage, where the sisters covered broken panes with greased parchment rather than pay for glass. The wall changed everything. On the first night after completing it, the wind that had moved freely through the cave struck the logs instead of her body. The sound shifted from a whistle to a moan, the pitch dropping as the opening narrowed. Inside, the air stilled. The cave's natural temperature, that unchanging coolness, began to warm as her body heat accumulated without being swept away. She slept better than she had in weeks. But warmth required fire, so she turned next to the hearthstones. This took longer to solve. Her first attempt, a fire pit just inside the doorway, filled the cave with smoke within minutes. The draft pulled inward, drawing smoke with it, leaving her coughing against the back wall. Her second attempt, a fire set outside the entrance against the log wall, threw most of its heat outward into the wind. Wasted. She sat for a full day, watching how the air moved, holding a burning twig at different points around the entrance, observing the direction of the smoke. The air entered low through gaps beneath the door. It exited high through the unsealed top of the wall where the logs met the natural rock ceiling. If she placed the fire outside the doorway but shielded from the wind, the heat would push inward through the door while the smoke rose along the outer face of the wall, drawn upward by the gap at the top. She set flat stones in a curve outside the entrance. A half circle, perhaps 4 feet across, opened toward the door. She built the fire inside this curve. The stones reflected heat inward. The doorway channeled it. The smoke rose along the wall's outer face, never entering the cave. The third attempt worked. That night, she sat on her blankets with her back against the limestone, feeling the stones slowly absorb the heat that pushed through the doorway. It held. Long after the fire burned low, the stone released its stored warmth back into the air. The cave breathed in through the door, warmed by fire. absorbed by stone, released slowly through the night. She pressed her palm against the wall. Warm, not hot, steady. She closed her eyes. She had found something the Telfords had not intended her to find. The valley watched. Men passing on the lower road slowed their horses when smoke appeared above the ridge. Women carrying baskets from the general store looked up toward Briar Ridge, shook their heads. The widow Pruitt living in a cave. The pity was thick enough to taste, flavored with something less generous satisfaction perhaps. The quiet pleasure of watching someone confirm the prediction you made about them. She would come down. Everyone agreed. Before November, certainly. A cave was no place for a woman alone. The cold would teach her what pride could not. Phoebe Galt climbed the slope on an October afternoon the last week of the month. She was the valley's unofficial conscience, a woman in her 50s whose opinions carried weight, not because they were wise, but because they were loud. She arrived at the cave entrance breathing hard from the climb, her hands folded across her stomach, her expression hovering between concern, curiosity. She looked at the log wall. She looked at the hearthstones. She looked at Marin, who was stirring a small kettle of boiled potatoes over the fire, without acknowledging her presence. A cave is still a cave. The words came with the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking without being challenged. Marin did not look up from the kettle. She let the silence hold for 3 full breaths. Then, quietly, without emphasis, it keeps what it's given. Phoebe's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She stood for another moment, watching Marin stir, waiting for elaboration that did not come. Then she turned, walked back down the slope, her footsteps crunching on dry leaves. She would repeat the exchange to 3 different women before sundown, each time with a slightly different inflection, as if trying on interpretations like hats. None of them fit. She did not understand what Marin meant. She would. Eventually. November stripped the trees bare, revealing the valley below in sharp detail, every fence line, every roof, every chimney trailing its thread of smoke. From the cave entrance, Marin could see the Telford farmhouse clearly now, the gray boards of its siding, the dark rectangle of its front door. She could see Rufus crossing the yard in the mornings, his breath fogging in the cold. She could see Ida hanging laundry on the line that ran between the porch post, the barn corner. They did not look up. They had stopped looking up. The cave held warmth through the night now. Marin's system, the curved hearthstones, the fire outside the door, the log wall channeling heat inward, functioned with a reliability that surprised even her. She woke each morning to air that was cool but not cold, to stone that had spent the night slowly releasing the heat it absorbed during the day. She stacked firewood along the inside of the log wall, enough for a week at a time. She stored food on the natural shelves, dried beans, salt pork from the general store, purchased with the last of her savings, potatoes she had dug from Josiah's abandoned garden before the ground froze, apples from a wild tree on the south face of the ridge, small, tart, their skins russeted. She ate simply. She wasted nothing. The groundwater seep at the back of the cave proved reliable. Even as November's cold deepened, the water continued to flow, a thin, steady stream emerging from limestone that held a temperature the surface weather could not reach. She placed a tin cup beneath it, let it fill overnight. She would not need to melt snow for drinking water. This detail, small in appearance, was enormous in consequence. Water was weight. Water was time. Every minute she did not spend hauling snow was a minute spent on survival. The wolves came on a Tuesday, the second week of November. She heard them before she saw them, a breathing in the darkness beyond the firelight, low, rhythmic, not the wind. She lay still on her stone platform, listening. The fire had burned low. Its glow reached only a few feet beyond the doorway, leaving the rest of Briar Ridge in blackness. Then a shape moved at the edge of the light. A second. Possibly a third. Farther back. Just a suggestion of mass shifting between the trees. They were drawn by the smell. Dried meat, salt pork, the faint trace of cooking fat that clung to the hearthstones. Marin's hands found the blanket's edge, gripping it. Not from fear, from calculation. She had no gun. Rufus had not offered one. Perhaps had not thought of it. Perhaps had thought of it deliberately. She had the axe, but an axe required proximity, required the animal to be within arm's reach. She needed distance. She needed something that said, "Do not come closer," without requiring her to say it herself. Fire. She rose slowly, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, moved to the doorway. The shapes froze. Two sets of eyes caught the dying firelight, yellow-green, low to the ground, steady. She reached into the fire's remains, pulled out a length of half-burned hickory. Its end glowed orange, pulsing with heat. She held it in front of her body, the warmth pressing against her face. She did not wave it. She did not shout. She stood in the doorway with the burning stick between herself, the darkness, letting the light do the talking. The wolves held their position for what felt like minutes. Then the nearest one shifted its weight, took a step backward. The second followed. The shapes dissolved into the tree line, becoming shadow, becoming nothing. Marin stood in the doorway until her arm ached from holding the branch. Then she fed the fire, built it higher than she normally would, let the light push farther into the night. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the log wall, the axe across her knees, watching the entrance until dawn grayed the sky. They returned the next night. Two this time, maybe the same pair. They came closer. She could see the outline of a shoulder, the glint of teeth as one yawned or tested the air. She repeated the ritual: burning branch, doorway, stillness. They retreated faster this time, as if remembering. The third night she heard them circling the ridge above the cave, their footfalls soft on dry leaves. They did not approach the entrance. On the fourth morning she built a barrier, stakes cut from young hickory, sharpened at one end, driven into the ground in a line across the cave's entrance, angled outward. Not a fence, a declaration. The points caught the firelight at dusk, throwing small, sharp shadows across the ground. That night nothing came. The night after, nothing. The wolves had read the message. They did not return. But the encounter left something in her that had not been there before. Not fear, awareness. The understanding that she was not simply living in the wilderness but negotiating with it, conducting a conversation that had no end, only ongoing terms. The cave was shelter. The fire was language. The stakes were grammar. Everything she built was a sentence in a dialogue with a landscape that did not care whether she survived but would respect the terms she set if she set them clearly enough. December arrived heavy with cold. The temperature dropped in stages, first the mornings, then the evenings, then the midday hours, until even noon felt like dusk. Frost grew on the inside of the oiled paper window, tiny crystals that caught the firelight like scattered pins. The log wall groaned as the wood contracted in the cold, settling tighter against itself. The moss packing, compressing into seals that held more firmly than she had expected. The cave responded to winter the way a well-built house responds, not by fighting the cold but by holding its own temperature steady, letting the limestone's thermal mass do what it had done for millennia. She discovered the cave's deeper properties by accident. One evening in mid-December she walked to the back wall to fill her water cup. The air near the seep was warmer than the air near the entrance, not by much, perhaps 5 degrees, but enough to notice. She pressed her palm against the deep wall. Warm. Warmer than the front wall, which received direct heat from the fire. This warmth came from below, from the earth itself, from rock that extended hundreds of feet into the hillside, where the temperature held a constant 55 degrees regardless of the season. The cave was not simply a container for the heat she provided. It was generating its own warmth, modest but persistent, a background hum of geological patience that supplemented everything she built on the surface. She began sleeping near the back wall. The difference was immediate. She woke warmer. Her blankets stayed dry. The groundwater's gentle sound became a kind of clock. Drip, 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 marking time without urgency. She arranged her food stores along the walls, using the natural shelves at varying heights. Dried beans on the highest shelf where the air was driest. Salt pork wrapped in cloth on a middle shelf. Potatoes in a wooden crate on the floor near the back, where the temperature was coolest but never freezing. Apples in a basket, their tart smell mixing with the mineral scent of limestone until the cave carried an odor that was entirely its own: smoke, stone, iron, water, fruit. By Christmas, she had enough food for 6 weeks. Not abundant, not comfortable, enough. She rationed with the precision of someone who had spent a childhood measuring portions at the orphanage, measuring thread at the mill, measuring her words in a valley that did not want to hear them. She ate 2 meals a day. She never ate after dark. She kept a running count in her head: beans, pork, potatoes, apples, updating the number each evening the way a banker updates a ledger, except the currency was survival, each entry representing a day she could continue to exist. The valley below prepared for winter in its usual way. Rufus Telford stacked cordwood in the shed beside his barn, 4 cords deep, enough for the season. Ida sealed the farmhouse windows with rags dipped in tallow. Other families along Kettle Creek did the same, their chimneys thickening with smoke as the cold pressed down. No one climbed Briar Ridge. No one sent word. Marin watched from the cave entrance as the valley settled into its winter routine, a community drawing inward like a fist closing, each household sufficient unto itself. She was not part of that fist. She was the finger they had let go. New Year's Day, 1884. Marin stood at the entrance of the cave, her breath making brief clouds in the morning air. Below, smoke rose from every chimney in Kettle Creek, a dozen thin columns climbing straight in the still cold, marking each household like candles on a map. She counted them the way she counted her stores, each plume representing a family she could name, a door that had never opened for her, a table where no chair had been set. She had survived October, November, December, 3 months alone on a hillside that was supposed to break her. The cave held its warmth, the water flowed, the food held. Her hands, scarred from building, had healed into new shapes, harder, thicker, the skin mapped with calluses that told the story of every log she had lifted, every stone she had set. She was not the same woman who had climbed this hill in September with a cooking pot in one hand, bewilderment in her chest. She was not sure what she had become instead. Something quieter, something with roots. The hearthstones outside the entrance were blackened from 3 months of steady fire, the limestone permanently darkened in a half-moon pattern that would outlast her, that would remain on this hillside long after her bones returned to the earth. She had marked the mountain, not with a name, not with a flag, with heat, with the patient repetition of keeping herself alive. She pressed her palm against the wall one more time. The stone answered with its steady warmth. Below, the valley moved through its ordinary morning, horses pulling carts, a dog barking at something near the creek, the distant sound of an axe striking wood. Ordinary sounds from ordinary lives that had decided she was not worth including. They assumed she would come down when the real cold arrived. They assumed Briar Ridge would teach her a lesson she had not yet learned, that a woman alone, without family, without means, without the valley's approval, could not survive a West Virginia winter in a hole in a hill. They assumed this because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative required them to reconsider what they had done, the land they had given, the dismissal they had dressed up as generosity. Reconsidering was uncomfortable. So they waited instead, confident in the cold's ability to do what they would not do openly. They did not know what was coming. Not for her. The real cold was gathering in the north, a storm system building over the Great Lakes, pulling Arctic air down through Pennsylvania, through the mountain passes, toward the Allegheny valleys where small communities like Kettle Creek sat exposed in the cupped palms of the hills. A storm that would bury fences, bend roof beams, silence chimneys. A storm that would turn the valley's confidence into something fragile, something that broke under weight. The real cold was coming. But it was not coming for Marin Pruitt. She had already made her peace with it. She had built a wall, set hearthstones, stacked food, found water. She had faced wolves in the dark with nothing but a burning stick, her own refusal to step backward. She had taken the hole in the hillside they gave her, expecting it to swallow her whole, instead had made it into the thing that held her steady. The cave kept what it was given, so did she. Marin turned from the entrance. She fed the fire. The warmth gathered in the stones, patient, certain. Night fell over Briar Ridge, over Kettle Creek, over the whole sleeping valley. The cold pressed down, the cave held. Above the tree line, the first thin clouds of the coming storm appeared against the stars, pale, fast-moving, silent. No one in the valley looked up to see them. No one on Briar Ridge needed to. Marin Pruitt was already ready. She had been ready since September. The storm announced itself 2 days before it arrived, not with clouds, with silence. The birds vanished first, the juncos that usually clustered near the hearthstones in the morning, picking at crumbs, disappeared on the 5th of January without explanation. Then the wind died. Not gradually, the way wind normally fades, but completely, as if someone had closed a door on the entire valley. The air went still, heavy, tasting of iron. Marin noticed. She had spent 3 months learning to read the mountain's language, its vocabulary of sound, temperature, animal movement. When every sentence stopped at once, it meant something was being composed that the landscape did not have words for yet. She checked her stores that evening with particular care. Firewood stacked inside the log wall, 43 pieces of split oak, 18 pieces of hickory, a bundle of smaller kindling tied with hemp cord. She counted twice. At her normal burning rate, 3 medium pieces during the day, 2 at night. She had enough for 12 days. If she cut back, 14. On the natural shelves, dried beans in a cloth sack, enough for 10 meals. Salt pork, a brick-sized piece wrapped in muslin, maybe 8 meals if she sliced thin. Potatoes, 14 remaining, their skins wrinkled but firm. 6 apples, past their prime, soft in spots but still edible. The water seep at the back wall continued its patient drip. No concern there. She sealed the oiled paper window with an extra layer of grease that night, pressing rendered fat into the edges where cold air sometimes whispered through. She checked the moss packing between the logs, pushing her finger into each gap, feeling for drafts. 2 spots near the top of the wall had loosened over the winter. She packed them with fresh moss from her small reserve supply, working the material in with her thumbs until no air moved through. She placed 3 extra stones against the base of the door, not to barricade it, but to reduce the gap where ground-level wind could slide beneath. Then she waited. January 7th, 1884. The sky that morning was the color of a bruised purple-gray, low, moving fast from the northwest. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight. Maren could feel it in the stone beneath her palms, a subtle cooling at the surface even as the deeper rock held its geological warmth. By noon the first flakes appeared, small, dry, riding a wind that had returned, with a voice she had not heard before, deeper than November's gusts, steadier, carrying a weight that pressed against the log wall like a hand testing a locked door. By late afternoon the snow was falling thick enough to erase the valley below. The farmhouses vanished first, then the fences, then the tree line at the base of Briar Ridge. The world contracted to a circle of visibility perhaps 50 feet across, everything beyond it white, formless, roaring. The wind struck the log wall in sustained blasts that made the oiled paper window flex inward like a breathing lung. Maren fed the fire in careful measures, 1 piece of oak, split to expose the dry heartwood, placed at the center of the hearthstone curve where the heat would push inward through the doorway. Not too much fuel, not too little. Discipline now would determine whether she emerged from this storm or became part of the hillside permanently. Night fell without any visible change in the sky. The snow simply shifted from white against gray to white against black, the flakes catching the firelight for a brief instant before being swept sideways into the dark. The sound was constant, a roar with texture, like fabric tearing slowly, endlessly, the air itself being pulled apart. Maren moved to the back of the cave where the temperature held steadier, where the limestone walls narrowed to a space just wide enough for her blankets. Her body, the faint warmth rising from the earth below. She slept in intervals, waking to feed the fire, each time opening the door just enough to reach the hearthstone curve, each time feeling the cold slam against her face with physical force, a fist made of wind carrying ice. The first full day passed without event. The storm held its intensity from hour to hour, neither building nor fading, a plateau of violence that felt less like weather than like intention. Maren ate sparingly boiled potatoes, a thin slice of salt pork, water from the seep. She kept the fire burning at minimum effective output, each piece of wood earning its place in the flames. She did not pace. She sat with her back against the warm rear wall, mending a tear in her coat sleeve, with stitches so small they were almost invisible. The needle moved through the fabric with the same rhythm as the water dripping behind her. Stitch, drip, stitch, drip. The cave held its air. The wall held the wind. The hours moved slowly, but they moved. On the second morning she opened the door. She had to push hard. Snow had drifted against the log wall during the night, packing itself with the density of something that intended to stay. The door moved inward. She had built it that way deliberately, knowing outward opening doors could be sealed shut by drift weight. She forced it open enough to look out, white. Everywhere, in every direction, at every depth. The snow stood shoulder high against the wall, a solid face of compressed white that rose above the hearthstones, burying the fire curve completely. Beyond it, the world was gone. No fence lines, no roads, no rooftops. The valley below had been erased with the thoroughness of a hand wiping chalk from a slate. Even the trees on the lower slope had disappeared, their trunks swallowed, only the upper branches visible as dark scratches against the falling white. Then Maren looked south, toward where the Telford farmhouse should have been. She could not see the house, she could not see the barn, the yard, the path that led from their front door to the road. But she could see the place where the chimney should have been making its mark against the sky. In 30 years, that chimney had never failed in winter. Rufus Telford maintained it the way some men maintain their reputation, constantly, visibly, with pride that bordered on obsession. He swept it in October. He inspected the mortar in November. He kept a fire burning from the first frost until the last thaw, a continuous thread of smoke that announced to the valley, "This house is alive. This house is warm. This house endures." No smoke. Maren stood in the doorway with cold air cutting her face, staring at the absence where that smoke should have been. Snow drove into her eyes. She blinked it away, looked again. Nothing rose from where the chimney stood. No gray thread. No pale wisp. The air above the Telford farm was as empty as the air above the buried fields, the buried roads, the buried fences. Empty the way air is empty above a house where the fire has died. She closed the door. She stood in the dim light of the cave, snow melting on her eyelashes, her breath making small clouds that dissolved against the warm limestone. Her eyes narrowed. She did not speak. Something heavy moved through her chest, not panic, not grief, recognition. The understanding that the storm was not testing her. It had already tested her, months ago when she first climbed this hill with a cooking pot in one hand. She had passed. The storm was testing them now. The people who had given her a hole in a hillside, expecting it to break her. The people whose chimney had never failed. Until today. The second day passed. The storm did not relent. Maren sat in the cave with that knowledge pressing against her ribs like a stone she had swallowed. No smoke. The words repeated in her mind with the regularity of the water dripping behind her. She could do nothing. The snow outside was shoulder high, the wind strong enough to knock a person off their feet, the visibility reduced to arm's length. Going out in this was not courage. It was arithmetic, the kind where every number pointed to 0. She stayed. She fed the fire. She ate a potato, a strip of pork. She waited. On the third morning, the storm stopped, not gradually. The wind cut off as if severed. The snow ceased falling between one breath, the next. The roaring silence replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against her eardrums. Maren lay on her blankets, eyes open, listening. Nothing, no wind, no driving snow, no creak of branches bending under weight. The world had gone mute. She rose, dressed in both coats, the wool one Josiah had given her, the canvas one she had sewn herself from mill scraps. She wrapped her scarf tight around her throat, tucked the ends into her collar. She pulled on her gloves, the leather ones with the split seam at the left thumb that she had repaired twice. She unbarred the door. Snow pressed against it with the weight of something that had been leaning there all night, waiting to be acknowledged. She pushed. The door moved an inch, 2 inches. Light entered the cave, white, blinding, total. She pushed harder, bracing her boots against the stone floor. The door opened a foot, then 2 feet, snow falling inward across the threshold in chunks that broke apart on the warm stone. White light flooded the cave's entrance, reflecting off the limestone walls, turning the dim space brilliant. 8 feet, maybe more in places where the wind had sculpted drifts against the ridge face. The valley lay buried, transformed from a landscape of fences, fields, roads into a single white plain broken only by the dark tips of the tallest trees. The creek was invisible. The road was invisible. The Telford barn, a structure large enough to hold 12 head of cattle, showed only its peak, a dark triangle rising from snow's dorsal fin. The chimney stood cold. Maren looked at it for a long time. The chimney was visible now, a gray column of stone rising above the snow line, its cap dusted white. No heat shimmer, no smoke stain on the surrounding snow, nothing rising from its mouth but the blank morning air. 3 days without fire. 3 days in a house that was built for warmth but had lost its source, its temperature dropping hour by hour, the cold moving through the walls, the way water moves through cloth slowly, thoroughly, without mercy. She stepped back inside the cave. She looked at her stacked wood, 31 pieces remaining, enough for 8 more days at minimum burn. She looked at the warm limestone walls, dark with absorbed heat, radiating their steady temperature back into the air. She looked at the water seep, still dripping, still flowing. She looked at the small world she had built from what they had meant as dismissal. Some decisions are not difficult. They are simply clear. The difficulty is everything that comes after. Marin took the mattock from its hook on the log wall. The tool was heavy, a broad blade on one side, a pick on the other, a hickory handle worn smooth by Josiah's grip. She had used it to break ground for her hearthstones in October. She had used it to pry loose rocks from the cave floor for her sleeping platform. Now she would use it to cut a path through 8 feet of snow, down a quarter-mile slope to a house that had tried to get rid of her. She tightened her scarf, she adjusted her gloves, she stepped through the doorway into the drift. The snow swallowed her legs by the 3rd step. It packed around her thighs with the intimacy of something that wanted to hold her in place, to absorb her into its blank surface the way it had absorbed the fences, the roads, the valley's entire geography. She drove the mattock handle down before each stride, testing depth, searching for the buried ground through vibration rather than sight. The handle struck differently depending on what lay beneath: a dull thud for earth, a sharp knock for rock, a hollow tap for wood, fence post, buried branch, stone wall. She read the snow's contents through the handle the way a blind person reads a page, each impact translating into information that kept her moving forward instead of stepping into a hidden ravine or a drift deep enough to swallow her standing. The sun hit the snow with a brilliance that made her eyes ache. She squinted until the world became a bright slit. The details reduced to shapes: the dark line of the ridge behind her, the white expanse below, the gray interruption of the chimney marking her destination. Each step required effort that started in her hips, moved through her lower back, finished in her shoulders as she pulled each leg free of the snow's grip. The mattock swung in rhythm: plant, test, step, plant, test, step. Her breath came steady, deliberate. She could not afford to gasp. Gasping meant wasted heat. Wasted heat meant sweat. Sweat in this temperature meant freezing from the inside out, your own body's moisture becoming the thing that killed you. Halfway down the slope, the ground shifted. Not much. A vibration that started beneath her right foot traveled up through her knee, reaching her hip before she consciously registered what it was. The snowpack was settling, millions of pounds of compressed ice adjusting to the sun's first, releasing internal tension the way a sleeping's body shifts in the night. She froze. The vibration stopped. She waited, counting heartbeats. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. She took another step. The snow beneath her left foot gave way, not downward but sideways. A lateral slide that pulled her body with it. The world tilted. She threw the mattock forward, drove the pick end into the surface, felt it bite through the crust into harder snow beneath. Her legs swept out from under her as the snowpack above her right hip released in a slow, grinding cascade, not an avalanche, not the catastrophic wall of white that buries climbers in the high mountains, but a sheer slip. A section of compacted snow roughly 10 feet wide breaking free from the slope beneath it, carrying everything on its surface downhill. She slid 15 feet before the mattock held. The pick had caught something solid beneath the snow, a buried root, a rock ledge, something that refused to move when everything else did. Her arms screamed, her shoulders burned, her chest pressed against the snow's surface, the cold driving through both coats, through her shirt, through her skin, reaching for the heat in her core with the patience of something that had all day. She held. The sliding snow passed around her, above her, a river of white moving downhill with a sound like sand pouring from a bucket. Then it stopped. Silence again. She lay pressed against the slope, the mattock anchoring her, her breath making small craters in the snow 3 inches from her face. She could feel her heart in her throat, in her wrists, in the tips of her fingers where the cold had already begun its work. A numbness that started at the nails, crept toward the knuckles, settling into the joints like something that intended to stay permanently. She pulled herself up. The mattock came free with a jerk. She stood knee-deep in the relocated snow, looking downhill. The slip had carried her closer to the farmhouse. She could see the 2nd-story window now, its top edge visible above the drift, the glass dark, frosted from inside. No light, no movement. She kept going. The cold bit through her gloves completely now. Her fingers had passed through the numbness into something worse, a burning sensation, as if the cold had reversed itself, become heat. The nerves so confused by temperature, they could no longer distinguish between the two. She gripped the mattock handle tighter, using the pressure to keep feeling, to keep her hands registered as parts of her body rather than objects attached to her wrists. The sun climbed higher, throwing her shadow long across the snow, a dark stretched figure that looked nothing like her, that looked like something ancient, something that had been walking through white landscapes since before people had names. The farmhouse roof appeared first, a white rise where shingles should have been visible, the snow covering them in a uniform blanket that made the structure look less like a building, more like a geological feature, a hill within the hill. Then the top edge of the second-story window, closer now, the frost on its inner surface thick enough to be opaque. Then the south door buried to the lintel. She began cutting. The mattock blade struck the compacted snow with each swing, sending arcs of white powder back into her face, into her eyes, down her collar where it melted against her neck in cold streams that ran along her spine. Her shoulders burned from the repetition, the same muscles, the same motion, the same angle, over again. The kind of labor that does not tire you gradually but all at once, a sudden collapse of capacity that arrives without warning. She did not stop. She could not stop. Behind that door, behind that buried wood, behind that frosted glass, people were dying slowly in a house that had forgotten how to keep them warm. She cleared enough snow to reach the latch. Her fingers could barely close around the handle. The numbness had reached her palms now, turning her grip into something she had to watch rather than feel, her eyes confirming what her nerves could not. She knocked. The sound was dull, absorbed by the cold wood, swallowed by the snow packed around the frame. No answer. She knocked again, harder, using the base of her fist. A sound shifted inside, not strong, not a voice exactly. A movement, something between a shuffle, a sigh, as if the house itself were breathing its last. The door opened inward. Slowly. An inch, then two. A face appeared in the gap. Ida Telford, wrapped in 3 blankets layered so thickly she looked twice her normal size. Her skin was gray, not pale, gray, the color of a sky before snow, the color of ash that has been wet then dried again. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculation, were dull, focused somewhere between Marin's face, the snow behind her, as if the effort of seeing clearly was more than she could afford. Behind Ida the hallway stretched into dimness. No lamp burned, no candle. The house held a gray stillness that Marin recognized from the orphanage, from the dormitory on mornings when the furnace failed, the particular quality of cold that exists inside a structure designed for warmth when the warmth has been removed. It was not the honest cold of the outdoors, the clean bite of wind against skin. It was a betrayed cold, a cold that felt personal, as if the house were punishing its occupants for failing to maintain their end of the bargain. The hearth was nearly dead. A few coals glowed weakly in a bed of gray ash, not enough heat to warm a hand held directly above them, certainly not enough to push warmth into the room. Beside the hearth, Rufus Telford sat upright in a wooden chair. His posture was rigid, his spine pressed against the chair back as if movement in any direction might tip him past a threshold he could not return from. His beard was rimed with frost, his own breath condensing on the hair, freezing there in tiny crystals that caught what little light came through the frosted windows. His hands rested on his knees. The fingertips were dark, purpled at the nails, the skin below the knuckles swollen with the first stages of frostbite. He looked at Marin without speaking. Then she saw the chair legs. 3 chairs at the kitchen table stood on intact legs. The fourth, the one nearest, the hearth, stood on shortened stumps, its legs sawn off at the knee. The missing pieces lay in the ash of the fireplace, half consumed, the grain of the wood still visible where the flame had not yet reached. They had burned their furniture. When the firewood ran out, when the cold became more urgent than dignity, they had taken a saw to their own chairs, fed the pieces to a fire that ate them without gratitude. Marin looked through the kitchen window at the side of the house. The woodshed was visible, or what remained of it. The roof had collapsed. The ridge beam, a heavy oak timber that had supported the shed's weight for decades, had cracked under the snow's accumulation sometime during the first night of the storm. The entire structure had pancaked, dropping its roof onto the 4 cords of seasoned firewood Rufus had stacked in October. The wood was still there, all of it, enough for the entire winter, but it lay crushed beneath 600 pounds of broken timber covered by 4 feet of snow, uneachable. Visible through the window, taunting in its proximity. Rufus could see his firewood from his chair. He simply could not get to it. "You're coming with me." Marin's voice was quiet in the frozen room, not a request but a statement of fact, the way a doctor speaks when the diagnosis leaves no room for discussion. Rufus's neck muscles stood out against his skin, cords of resistance pulling against the reality of what she was offering: rescue from his own house, delivered by the woman he had sent up the hill 5 months ago with a folded paper meant to remove her from his sight. His pride was a physical thing in that room, as solid as the frozen walls, as present as the dead hearth. It sat between them the way the kitchen table sat between them, immovable, familiar, inadequate for the moment. Ida did not argue. She turned from the door with a movement that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this, had known it would come to this, had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, quietly, practically, without wasted motion. She moved to the base of the staircase where 2 small bundles sat tied with twine, packed tight, ready. How long had they been there? Since the chimney died, since the first night without fire. Had Ida sat in this freezing house, wrapping blankets around herself in layers, watching her husband's breath frost his own beard, knowing that if help came at all, it would come from the one person they had tried to push away? The bundles answered the question she did not ask. Ida had known. Rufus tried to stand without help. He placed both hands on the chair arms, pressed down. His body rose an inch, 2 inches. His knees shook, a single violent tremor that passed through both legs simultaneously, the muscles firing out of sequence, confused by cold, by stiffness, by the particular kind of weakness that comes not from lack of strength but from lack of heat. He pressed again, his knees locked. He stood swaying slightly, his hands still gripping the chair arms. Then he released them, one finger at a time, as if peeling himself away from the last solid thing in a tilting world. Marin did not reach for him. She waited. The waiting was deliberate, not cruelty, not indifference, something more precise. She understood that a man like Rufus Telford measured his worth in his capacity to stand on his own, to cross his own threshold without assistance. Taking that from him, even in rescue, would cost something she was not willing to charge. So she stood at the door with the mattock in her hand, the cold pressing against her back, giving him the 10 seconds he needed to find his balance. He found it. He stepped forward. His boots scraped against the frozen floorboards with a sound like sandpaper on wood. He did not look at her as he passed through the doorway. He looked straight ahead, into the white, blinding world outside, his eyes narrowing against the glare the way they had narrowed against weather for 58 years. Ida followed, her bundles under each arm, her blankets trailing behind her like a robe worn by someone who had given up on ceremony. She pulled the farmhouse door closed behind her. It latched with a click that sounded in the frozen silence like something final, a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. The walk back up Briar Ridge took 3 times longer than the walk down. Marin led, cutting the path with the mattock, each swing breaking the snow's crust, so those behind her could step into the depression she left. The trail was narrow, wide enough for one person, no more. Rufus walked second, his boots finding the holes her boots had made, his breathing audible now, a ragged draw that caught in his chest every 3rd or 4th inhale. Ida walked behind him, one hand under his elbow, steadying without pulling, her fingers wrapped around the fabric of his coat sleeve. No one spoke. Speaking required breath, breath required warmth, warmth required conservation. Every word was a calorie they could not afford. Rufus stumbled at the quarter mark. His right boot caught the lip of a buried rock, pitching him forward. His hands went out, plunging into the snow to the wrists. Ida braced behind him, her small frame absorbing his weight without buckling, her feet sliding back 6 inches in the packed trail before holding. He pushed himself up. Snow clung to his gloves, to his coat front, melting against the fabric, refreezing in the wind. He stood, took a breath, kept walking. He stumbled again near the halfway point. This time his left knee gave out entirely, not a stumble but a collapse, the joint simply refusing to bear weight, folding inward. He went down on one knee in the trail, his head dropping forward, his breath coming in short visible bursts. Ida knelt beside him, her hand on his back. Marin stopped cutting, turned, looked back at them. Something passed between Rufus, Marin in that moment. He was kneeling in the snow at the midpoint of a hill she had climbed alone in September, carrying everything she owned. He was being rescued by a woman he had given a worthless piece of land to, a hole in a hill, 5 rocky acres of dismissal dressed up as charity. The irony was too large for words. It filled the space between them the way the snow filled the valley, completely, silently, without leaving room for anything else. Marin did not speak. She turned back to the trail. She swung the mattock. She waited for the sound of his boots behind her. It came slowly, unevenly, but it came. He had risen. He was walking. That was enough. The wolves appeared at the 3/4 mark. Marin saw them first, two shapes, standing motionless in the tree line 30 yards to the east, their gray-brown coats blending with the bark of the snow-covered hemlocks. They were thin. Winter had worked on them the same way it worked on everything, reducing them to essentials: bone, muscle, hunger. Their eyes tracked the 3 humans moving through the deep trail, calculating. 3 bodies. 1 large, 2 smaller. 1 moving slowly, unsteadily. The arithmetic of predation is simple. Wolves assess weakness the way water finds a crack automatically, without malice, through the pure mechanics of survival. Marin stopped. She raised the mattock to shoulder height, the blade facing outward. The tool was not a weapon in any practical sense, too heavy for a quick swing, too unwieldy for defense against something fast. But it was large. It extended her silhouette. Combined with her upright posture, her stillness, it changed the equation. She was not prey. She was not fleeing. She was standing. Behind her, Rufus had seen them. His body changed. The exhaustion that had been pulling him downward reversed itself. Something older rising through his muscles. Something that predated the cold, the frostbite, the humiliation of rescue. His right hand reached down. His fingers, swollen with cold, closed around a fallen branch protruding from the snow, a hickory limb, 3 feet long, thick enough to serve. He pulled it free. The motion cost him visible effort, but the branch came loose with a snap of frozen bark. He held it at his side, his arm trembling, the branch trembling with it. Ida stood between them, her bundles clutched against her chest. She did not scream. She did not retreat. She pressed herself against Rufus's back, making the 2 of them into a single shape, a larger silhouette that the wolves would have to assess as 1 unit rather than 2 individuals. Her breathing was the only sound, quick, controlled through her nose. 3 humans, standing, armed with a mattock, a branch, not running, not falling, not offering the behavioral signatures that trigger a predator's chase response. The wolves held their ground, their heads low, their eyes steady. The nearest one shifted its weight from one front paw to the other, a subtle adjustment that Marin recognized from November, from the nights at the cave entrance. It was measuring, deciding. The decision took 30 seconds. It felt like 30 minutes. The nearer wolf turned its head, looked at its companion, then looked back at the trail. Some communication passed between them: scent, posture, some frequency of assessment that humans cannot access. Both wolves took a step backward, then another. Then they turned, not quickly, not in fear, but with the deliberate withdrawal of something that has decided the cost exceeds the return. They moved into the hemlocks. The trees absorbed them. The snow held their tracks for a moment before the wind began filling them in. Marin lowered the mattock. Her arms shook. Behind her, she heard Rufus release a breath he had been holding for the entire encounter, a long, shuddering exhale that fogged the air around his head like a small personal storm. He dropped the branch. It fell into the snow without sound. Ida loosened her grip on his coat. Her fingers had left indentations in the frozen fabric. No one spoke. They kept walking. The cave wall appeared through the trees. 10 minutes later, the log faced dark against the white hillside. The hearthstones blackened. A thin line of smoke rising from the fire Marin had banked before leaving. Not dramatic, certain. The smoke climbed straight in the still air, a thread of gray against the blue sky. The first blue sky in 3 days. It was the most beautiful thing Rufus Telford had ever seen. He stopped at the tree line, his boots sinking into the drift. He stared. The logs she had cut by hand, notched with imperfect joints, packed with moss that had held through the worst storm in 30 years. The hearthstones she had arranged in their careful curve, their surfaces permanently darkened by months of steady fire. The narrow doorway, the oiled paper window, a home built from a dismissal, a shelter constructed from the materials of contempt. He looked at it the way a man looks at a word he has been mispronouncing his entire life. The sudden recognition that the sound he had been making meant something entirely different from what he had intended. Ida stepped inside first. Her shoulders dropped as the warmth touched her skin, a physical release, visible, unmistakable. The tension she had carried for 3 days, the rigid posture of someone holding their body tight against cold, dissolved in the space of 2 breaths. Her eyes closed, her lips parted. The warmth entered her lungs, her chest expanded, her hands unclenched from the bundles she had been gripping since the farmhouse. She stood in the center of the cave, blankets trailing, breathing. Rufus followed. He ducked through the low doorway, straightened inside. The air was different here, a temperature that did not demand attention, that simply existed, the way good health exists unnoticed until it is absent, then desperately missed. He looked at the walls, the stacked firewood, the food on the natural shelves, the water seep dripping its patient rhythm at the back. He looked at all of it with an expression that had no name he would have recognized. Not shame, exactly, not guilt. Something adjacent to both, but deeper, the feeling of standing inside, proof of your own misjudgment. He pressed his palm against the limestone wall. He held it there. The stone was warm. Not from the fire's heat reached the front wall only. This warmth came from below, from the deep earth, from the same geological patience that had held this temperature for 10,000 years before Rufus Telford was born, that would hold it for 10,000 years after he was dust. The warmth entered through his frozen skin, through the damaged tissue of his frost-bitten fingers, through the swollen knuckles, reaching the bone beneath. His hand trembled against the stone. Maren closed the door behind them. She moved to the fire, added wood, 2 pieces of oak, split thin, placed at the center of the hearthstone curve. The flame caught. Heat pushed inward through the doorway. The cave accepted it, the way it accepted everything quietly, without performance, simply absorbing what was given. They sat without speaking for a long time. Maren poured broth from a pot she had kept warm on a flat stone near the fire, bone broth, made from the remnants of salt pork simmered with dried beans, thin but hot, carrying more warmth per swallow than anything the Telford farmhouse had produced in 3 days. She poured it into 3 tin cups. She placed 2 of them on the stone floor between Ida. Rufus lifted his cup with both hands. His fingers could not fully close around it. The frostbite had swollen his joints past their normal range, turning his grip into something approximate, uncertain. The cup trembled in his hands. Broth moved toward the rim, caught the edge. He adjusted his grip. The trembling continued, but the broth stayed inside. He lifted the cup to his lips. He drank. Ida drank slowly, her eyes closed, each swallow deliberate, as if she were memorizing the temperature, storing it somewhere inside her body where the cold could not reach. The warmth moved through her visibly. Her color shifted from gray toward something closer to lissing, a faint flush appearing at her cheeks, at her throat. Her breathing slowed, her hands steadied. That night the wind returned. It rattled through what remained of the valley, snapping weakened branches, shifting snow from one drift to another, testing every structure that had survived the storm. Inside the cave, the warmth stayed steady. The limestone walls held their temperature. The fire breathed its heat inward through the doorway. 3 people slept where one had slept before, their bodies adding their own warmth to the cave's equation, the math of survival expanding to accommodate those who had tried to subtract her from it. On the second day, Rufus tried to step outside. He rose from his blankets near the front wall, moved toward the door with the stiff determination of a man who has spent his life believing that stillness is the same as surrender. His hand reached for the door bar. Maren's hand landed on his sleeve, not his arm, his sleeve, a touch so light it could have been accidental, so precise it could not have been. Not yet 2 words, no explanation, no softness designed to make the restriction palatable. She looked at his fingers, still swollen, still purple at the tips, the skin stretched tight over joints that had not yet decided whether to recover or to die. He needed warmth, more of it, longer. The cold was still inside him, lodged deep in the tissue, retreating slowly before the cave's patient heat. Sending him outside now would undo what the last 20 hours had rebuilt. Rufus looked at her hand on his sleeve. He did not argue. He turned from the door, walked back to his blankets, sat down. The act of sitting, of accepting restriction from a woman he had restricted, of receiving care from a person he had discarded, settled over him with visible weight. His shoulders curved inward slightly. Not defeat, adjustment. The posture of a large man discovering that the room he is in has a lower ceiling than he expected. On the 3rd day, Ida moved deeper into the cave. She had spent the first 2 days near the entrance, close to the fire, her body still craving the direct heat that she had gone without. Now she walked to the back wall where Maren's quilts hung from pegs driven into limestone cracks. Her fingers reached out, touched the stone. She paused. The temperature was different here, warmer than the front, warmer than the fire's direct reach should account for. She looked at Maren, who was sorting dried beans on the other side of the cave. She looked back at the wall. She pressed her palm flat against it. The stone held its warmth the way good people hold a secret completely, without effort, without any desire for recognition. Ida left her hand there. Her expression shifted through stages: surprise first, then something harder to name, something that lived in the space between understanding, regret. Her fingers spread against the limestone, feeling the heat enter through each one separately, as if the stone were speaking to her hand in a language she was only now learning to hear. That evening, Rufus slept near the back wall, his breathing finally even, his hands tucked inside his coat against his chest. Ida sat near the fire, wrapped in blankets, watching the flame's reflection move across the stone ceiling. Marin added wood without looking up, the motion practiced, automatic, her hands knowing the weight of each piece before she lifted it. Ida spoke quietly, not to the room, not to the fire, to the air between herself, the woman she had spent 5 months hoping would disappear. "I thought you would leave by November." Marin placed the wood on the fire. She did not turn. So did everyone. Ida swallowed. The sound was audible in the cave's quiet, a click of dry throat, of words that had been sitting in her chest for days, maybe longer, pressing against her ribs like stones. She had swallowed one at a time without noticing their accumulation. "We gave you this hill because we believed it would push you back east, back to Connecticut, back to wherever you came from before you came to us." Marin watched the fire catch the new wood. The bark curled, blackened, split open to reveal the pale, dry heartwood beneath. Orange light moved across her face. "You did not leave." Ida's voice was barely above a whisper now, the words escaping through a gap in her composure that she could not quite close. "No." The silence that followed filled the cave the way warmth filled the cave completely, without gaps, pressing into every corner. Outside, snow shifted off branches, falling to the ground with soft compressed sounds. Inside, the fire crackled once, sending a small shower of sparks upward toward the dark ceiling. Ida did not say she was wrong, not yet. The admission was forming somewhere inside her, somewhere deep, the way water forms in limestone slowly, through mineral patience, through the gradual dissolution of something that was once solid. It was not ready. She was not ready. But it was forming. Marin did not push. She did not turn to face the woman who had wanted her gone. She stirred the fire with a stick, sending the coals rearranging themselves in small orange avalanches. She let the silence do what silence does when it is allowed to work, carry weight that words would only cheapen. On the 5th morning, the sun struck the cave entrance for the first time since the storm began. Light slid across the stone floor in a bright wedge, catching dust motes, catching the faint steam rising from the warm interior, meeting the cold exterior air. The light reached Rufus's boots, climbed his legs, settled across his chest. He opened his eyes. Marin was already standing at the doorway looking out. The sky was blue, not the pale blue of winter mornings, but a deep, rinsed blue, the color that appears only after a storm has scrubbed the atmosphere clean. The snow glittered. The valley below lay white, still buried. But the first signs of emergence were visible dark lines, appearing where fences pushed through the drifts, a patch of exposed shingle on a distant roof. Rufus stood beside her. His movement was steadier now, 3 days of warmth having pushed the worst of the cold from his joints, his muscles. His fingers were still discolored, but the swelling had decreased. He could close his hands into fists again, though the motion cost him a wince he tried to hide. He looked down at the valley, white broken by narrow dark lines, the geography slowly reasserting itself beneath the snow's erasure. Smoke rose from a chimney far to the south, the Hadley farm, probably the first neighbor to dig out. The rest of the valley remained silent, buried, waiting. "We burned chair legs." His voice was rough, unused for 3 days except for the minimal sounds of survival grunts of effort, sighs of discomfort, the involuntary sounds the body makes when it is fighting to stay warm. The words came out as facts, stripped of decoration, carrying only their own weight. Marin kept her eyes on the horizon. Rufus's shoulders rose then fell. One breath, heavier than the others. He did not look at her. He looked at the valley he had lived in for 58 years, the valley that had watched a woman climb a hill with a cooking pot, that had waited for the hill to send her back down, that was now buried under the same snow that had nearly killed him in his own house. "When I gave you this land, I did not think you would stay long enough to learn it." The words came slowly, each one placed the way a man places stones in a wall, carefully, aware of weight, aware of the structure they are building. He stopped there. The sentence had more. Marin could hear it, the way you hear a held breath, the pause that means something is coming. Something that requires courage or time or both. He did not finish. Not yet. He stood at the entrance of the cave that had not defeated her, looking at the valley that had tried, his palm pressed flat against the doorframe she had built. Below them, the snow began its slow retreat. Above them, the sky stretched clean, infinite, indifferent. Between the two, the cave held its steady warmth, patient as always, asking nothing, keeping everything it was given. Rufus Telford left the cave on the 6th morning. He walked out through the doorway Marin had built, into the snow that had thinned slightly under 5 days of sun, down the trail that 3 bodies had carved into Briar Ridge. Ida followed, her bundles under her arms, her blankets folded neatly, returned to their owner before departure. Neither of them said goodbye. The word would have required a framework, a relationship category, a social contract that no longer existed between them. What had been between them before the storm was simple: family obligation toward an unwanted addition, discharged through dismissal disguised as generosity. What existed now had no name. It was too new, too raw, too uncomfortable to label. So they left without ceremony, their boot prints filling with loose snow behind them, the sound of their footsteps fading until the ridge held only its usual quiet. Marin stood at the entrance, watching them descend. Rufus moved more steadily. Now his joints loosened by 5 days of limestone warmth, his fingers still discolored but functional enough to grip the walking stick Marin had cut for him from a hickory branch. He did not use it as a crutch. He used it as a probe, the way she had taught him without teaching mattock handle first, read the snow's depth, then step. He was a fast learner when his pride allowed learning. Ida walked beside him rather than behind, her hand no longer under his elbow. The support had become unnecessary, or perhaps the gesture had outlived the crisis that justified it. Either way, they moved through the white landscape as two people who had survived something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. The farmhouse chimney produced smoke by noon. Marin saw it from the cave entrance, a thin gray line rising against the blue, tentative at first, then strengthening as the fire below it found its footing. Rufus had dug out the woodshed. The labor must have taken hours, his damaged hands working through snow packed hard as clay over collapsed timbers, pulling seasoned oak from beneath the wreckage one piece at a time. But the chimney spoke. The house breathed again. Smoke rose straight, confident, the way it had risen for 30 years, before the storm interrupted its sentence. Something had shifted, though, not in the chimney, not in the smoke, in the space between that farmhouse, this cave. A distance that had once meant exile now meant something else, proximity perhaps. The awareness that 2 points on a hillside, separated by a 1/4 mile of slope, were connected by more than geography, connected by debt, by survival, by the particular bond that forms when one person carries another through snow with a mattock in her hand, asking nothing in return, because asking would diminish what was freely given. The valley stirred. Roads appeared, first dark muddy lines where neighbors had shoveled, stomped, driven horses through the drifts until the packed snow compressed into something approaching passable. Then fences emerged, their posts leaning at new angles where the weight had pushed them sideways. Rooftops shed their white covering in stages, shingles appearing like patches of dark skin beneath a peeling bandage. Livestock that had survived, not all of it had called from barns, with voices made hoarse by 3 days of cold. The sounds carried uphill in the still air, reaching the cave entrance where Marin listened, the way she listened to everything, carefully, without sentiment, cataloging information the way she cataloged her food stores. The valley tried to talk about the storm the way valleys always talk about storms, in measurements, in comparisons, in the competitive arithmetic of suffering. 8 feet, someone declared at the general store. Roof beams bent on the Calder property. The Whitfield family lost 2 cows, a horse. Tom Farley's well house collapsed. Each household contributed its damage to the communal ledger, each entry earning a nod, a whistle, the particular sound men make when they want to acknowledge misfortune without appearing moved by it. The storm became a story. The valley told itself a story about weather, about endurance, about the random cruelty of a winter that exceeded its normal boundaries. But stories have a way of moving where they are not invited. No one would later admit to being the first mentioned that the Telford chimney had gone cold. That Rufus Telford, whose woodshed was the envy of Kettle Creek, whose chimney had not failed in 3 decades, had burned his own furniture to stay alive. That the widow Pruitt, the mill girl from Connecticut living in that cave on Briar Ridge, had dug her way down the hill through 8 feet of snow to pull him out. That she had brought them both, Rufus, Ida, back up to the cave, where they stayed for 5 days, eating her food, burning her wood, sleeping in the warmth of a shelter built from the very land they had given her as punishment. The story moved through Kettle Creek, the way the storm had moved through the valley, unstoppably, without regard for who wanted to hear it. It crossed kitchen tables, passed over fence lines, traveled the muddy roads in the pockets of men who repeated it to their wives, who repeated it to their neighbors, who repeated it to themselves in the quiet hours before sleep, when the mind returns to the things it cannot quite process. By Sunday, the story had reached every household within 5 miles. By the following Wednesday, it had acquired the weight of something permanent, not gossip, not rumor, but history. The kind of story that changes how a community sees itself. Men climbing the North Ridge paused when they passed the cave. They did not laugh. They did not shake their heads. They really looked at the log wall, the hearthstones, the thin line of smoke that rose from Marin's fire with the same steadiness it had shown since October. They looked the way you look at a word you have been reading wrong your entire life, suddenly seeing the correct pronunciation, feeling the slight vertigo of realizing that the error was yours. Otis Hadley came first, a Tuesday morning, the second week after the roads cleared. He appeared at the tree line, carrying a load of split oak on his right shoulder, his left hand gripping the rope that held the bundle together. He was a large man, thick through the chest, with a beard that grew in uneven patches, giving him a permanently unfinished appearance. He farmed 40 acres on the south side of Kettle Creek, corn, mostly some tobacco. He attended church irregularly. He spoke even less regularly. He was not the kind of man who made gestures. He was the kind of man who carried wood. He set the bundle by the cave wall without ceremony. The logs thudded against the frozen ground, a sound that carried more meaning than any sentence he might have constructed. He straightened, rubbed his hands on his trousers, looked at the cave entrance where Marin stood, with her arms crossed against the morning cold. Should have come sooner. The words came out, the way smoke comes out of a reluctant chimney in short bursts, with effort, carrying the residue of something that had been burning inside for a while. Marin looked at the wood. She looked at Otis. She gave him one nod, not deep, not performative, the nod of one person acknowledging another's presence without requiring more. "You're here now." Otis stepped inside the cave. He stood in the center of the space, his large frame filling it differently than Rufus's, had not with the weight of guilt, but with the weight of curiosity. His eyes moved across the walls, the shelving, the water seep at the back. He drew a breath through his nose, the particular intake of someone encountering a temperature they did not expect. His hand reached out, ran along the log frame where it met the natural stone, feeling the joint between what Marin had built, what the mountain had provided. He left without more words. His boot prints in the snow outside pointed downhill, each one deliberate, spaced evenly, the footprints of a man who had seen something he needed to think about before speaking of it again. Others followed that week, not in crowds, in ones, twos, a sack of potatoes left by the door still warm from someone's cellar, a jar of preserved peaches, the glass foggy with age, the fruit inside glowing amber in the winter light, an extra blanket, wool, smelling of cedar from the chest it had been stored in. No one named these offerings. No one called them repayment, apology, charity. They were placed quietly, sometimes when Marin was present, sometimes when she was not. Then the givers moved on, back down the hill, back into the valley that was slowly, reluctantly, reorganizing its understanding of the woman on the ridge. The gifts were not what mattered. What mattered was the looking. For 4 months, the valley had looked up at Briar Ridge with pity, with condescension, with the comfortable certainty that the cave was a temporary embarrassment that would resolve itself when the woman inside it finally accepted her defeat. Now they looked up with something else, not admiration. Exactly, the valley was not ready for that word. Recognition. The acknowledgement that what existed on that hillside was not desperation but competence, not survival but design. Phoebe Galt climbed the slope 3 days after Otis. She came alone, mid-afternoon, when the sun hit Briar Ridge at its warmest angle. She wore her church coat, the black one, with the velvet collar that she reserved for occasions she considered significant. Her hands were empty. She carried nothing but herself. She stood at the entrance longer than she needed to. The log wall looked different to her now, not the crude barrier she had dismissed in October, but a structure, deliberate in its construction, effective in its purpose. The moss between the logs had held through the worst storm in a generation. The hearthstones showed their months of use, darkened, seasoned, their surfaces carrying the permanent mark of sustained fire. Snow still lined the edges, melting slowly in the reflected heat, dripping from the stones in small clear streams that caught the light. Phoebe stepped inside. Her boots scraped lightly on the stone floor. The air touched her face, that same warmth Maren had discovered in September, the temperature that existed independent of weather, of season, of human opinion. Phoebe turned once in a slow circle, her eyes moving across the walls, the ceiling, the stored food, the water seep, the blankets folded near the back. Her face showed nothing at first, the careful blankness of a woman accustomed to controlling her expressions, to presenting the face she chose rather than the one she felt. Then her eyes lifted to the limestone ceiling. They stopped. The calcium deposits gleamed faintly in the firelight, a natural mineral pattern that looked, in certain angles, like a map of something, a river system, a network of roots, the branching pattern of a life that had found its way through stone. Phoebe's composure cracked, not dramatically, a fissure, a hairline fracture running through the careful surface she maintained. "It's steady in here." Her voice was different from October, smaller. The confidence that had carried her pronouncement, "a cave is still a cave," had been replaced by something less certain, something that sounded almost like wonder. "Yes." Phoebe pulled her right glove off with her teeth. She pressed her bare palm to the wall. The limestone met her skin with its patient warmth, the same warmth it offered everyone who touched it, without preference, without judgment. Her fingers spread against the stone. She held the contact for 5 breaths, 6, 7. "I misjudged this place." The words came stiffly, like joints that had not been bent in years. Each syllable cost her something: pride, certainty, the comfort of being right. She swallowed once. "I misjudged you." Maren stood beside the fire, a piece of kindling in her hand. She did not rescue Phoebe from the moment. She did not offer the polite deflection that would have made the admissions easier, the "it's fine," the "don't worry about it," the graceful exit that social convention provides for uncomfortable truths. She let Phoebe stand in the full weight of her own words, the way she had let herself stand in the full weight of the October wind, absorbing it, letting it pass through, refusing to be moved. Phoebe lowered her hand from the wall. She looked at the floor, then at Maren, then at the floor again. "When the chimney failed, Rufus would not have walked to my house. He would not have walked to anyone's house." She paused. The pause was heavy, loaded with the particular knowledge that comes from understanding your neighbors well enough to predict which of their virtues will kill them. "He would have stayed in that chair until—" She stopped. The sentence did not need its ending. Its ending was visible in the space she left behind it, in the cold weight of the word she could not bring herself to speak. Rufus Telford would have died in his own kitchen, seated upright in a chair missing its legs, his pride outlasting his body heat, his refusal to ask for help becoming the final entry in a life defined by self-sufficiency. Maren did not respond. Some truths do not require confirmation. They simply exist, the way stone exists, present, undeniable, too heavy to rearrange. Phoebe looked at her directly. For the first time since they had known each other, since that October afternoon when Phoebe had climbed the hill carrying her verdict like a gavel. She looked at Mur without the practiced smile, without the social mask, without the performance of neighborliness that substituted for the real thing. Her face was bare. It was not a comfortable face. It was the face of a woman confronting the distance between who she believed herself to be, who she had actually been. "You did not have to go down that hill." No. The syllable carried everything. It carried the choice, the mattock, the 8 feet of snow, the wolves, the frozen door, the moment Maren decided to save the people who had tried to erase her. It carried the absence of obligation. No duty, no debt, no contractual requirement had pulled her down that slope. Only something older, something that lived beneath logic, beneath grievance, beneath the reasonable argument that a person who has been cast out owes nothing to the people who cast them. Phoebe nodded once. She turned, stepped through the doorway into the afternoon sunlight. She walked down the slope without looking behind her. Her boot prints in the thinning snow were lighter than Otis's had been, narrower, spaced more closely. The prints of someone walking away from something they would not forget. 2 weeks after the storm, on a morning when the temperature rose above freezing, for the first time since December, a man Marin had never spoken to appeared on Briar Ridge. Virgil Creech rode a bay horse up the north trail, the animal picking its way through the remaining snow with the careful steps of a creature accustomed to rough ground. Creech was tall in the saddle, lean, his face sharpened by wind into angles that looked carved rather than grown. He owned the largest parcel in the valley, 320 acres, stretching from Kettle Creek north to the county line. His grandfather had been among the first settlers. His name appeared on the original land grants. He carried this history the way some men carry weapons, visibly, with the understanding that its presence alone was usually sufficient. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, looking at the cave, the log wall, the hearth stones, the thin smoke. He looked at all of it with the particular expression of a man calculating value, not sentimental value, not human value, but the hard arithmetic of property, of ownership, of what a piece of land might be worth, now that someone had proven it habitable. Marin stepped out of the cave carrying an armload of firewood. She set it down, straightened, looked up at Creech on his horse. She had seen him in the valley at the general store on the road, once at a church service she attended in her first month. They had not spoken. He existed in the stratum of Kettle Creek that did not acknowledge women like Marin, mill workers, orphans, wives of younger brothers. Mrs. Pruitt. His voice was formal, the courtesy a thin layer over something harder beneath. I've come about the land. Marin wiped her hands on her coat. She waited. Creech reached inside his saddlebag, withdrew a folded document, yellowed, creased along its folds, the paper thick with age. My grandfather, Samuel Creech, purchased the north face of this ridge from Rufus Telford's father in 1867. The agreement includes the hillside from the creek to the summit. He held the paper out, not offering it for her to take but displaying it, the way a man displays a card he believes will win the hand. The 5 acres you occupy were never formally transferred. There's no record at the county courthouse of any deed in your name. The land you're standing on, Mrs. Pruitt, may not be yours to stand on. The wind moved through the hemlocks. Snow slid from a branch somewhere behind the cave, landing with a soft, compressed sound. Marin looked at the document in Creech's hand. She looked at his face, the sharp angles, the steady eyes, the jaw set with the confidence of a man who has studied his position before entering the field. Before the storm, Mr. Creech, did you want this land? The question was quiet. It carried no hostility, no defensiveness. It was a mirror held up at precisely the right angle, reflecting back to Creech the timing of his arrival, the 5 months of silence that preceded it, the conspicuous absence of any claim until the cave had proven its worth. He had not ridden up this hill in September. He had not ridden up in October, November, December, or during the storm. He had ridden up now, after the valley had watched a woman survive what the valley itself could not, after the cave on Briar Ridge had become something other than a hole in a hill. Creech's jaw shifted. He did not answer. He folded the document, placed it back in his saddlebag, turned his horse. The animal's hooves broke through the snow crust with sharp crunching sounds as it descended the trail. Marin watched him go. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes, a calculation, a recognition of threat, engaged with the precision of a loom shuttle finding its track. Creech would not stop here. Men like Creech did not ride uphill to deliver information. They rode uphill to deliver warnings. 3 days passed. The temperature continued its slow climb. Icicles formed along the cave entrance where meltwater dripped from the rock face above, their shapes elongating each night, shortening each afternoon. A daily cycle of freezing, thawing that measured January's gradual surrender to February. Marin maintained her routine fire, food, water, wood. She patched a hole in her canvas coat where the fabric had torn during the descent to the farmhouse. She sharpened the mattock blade on a flat piece of sandstone she had found near the creek in October, the rhythmic scraping filling the cave with a sound like breath being drawn across teeth. She did not go to the valley. She did not seek Rufus. If what Creech carried in his saddlebag was real, if the 1867 agreement genuinely included Briar Ridge, then her position on this hillside rested on nothing but Rufus Telford's word, a word given casually, without legal documentation, the way you give away something you consider worthless. The 5 acres had been a dismissal. Dismissals do not come with deeds. Rufus came to her. He appeared on a Saturday morning, in the first week of February, climbing the trail with the deliberate pace of a man whose body had not fully forgiven the storm. He carried nothing visible, no rope, no beeswax, none of the practical offerings that would have justified the visit in the valley's transactional vocabulary. His hands were in his coat pockets. His hat sat low on his brow, shadowing his eyes. Marin was splitting wood when she heard his boots on the frozen trail. She did not stop. The axe rose, fell, each stroke precise, the blade finding the grain line that would separate the piece cleanly. She had learned this rhythm from Josiah, the only inheritance he had left her that was worth keeping. The wood split with a sound like a single hand clap, each piece falling to opposite sides of the chopping block. Rufus stopped at the edge of the clearing. He stood watching her swing, his face unreadable beneath the hat's shadow. After 6 strokes, he spoke. "I knew about this cave before I gave it to you." The axe continued its rhythm. Rise, fall, split. Marin did not look up. Her shoulders worked in the practiced rotation that distributed effort across her back, her arms, her core. A machine made of muscle, memory, necessity. Ezra told me about it 30 years ago. The axe paused. Not stopped, paused, held at the top of its arc, the blade catching the morning light for a half-second before Marin lowered it to her side. She looked at Rufus for the first time since he arrived. His face had changed since she had last seen it in the cave. The hard lines of his normal expression had returned, but something beneath them was different, more visible. As if a layer had been removed, the outermost coating of certainty that he had worn for 58 years, like a second skin, revealing the architecture beneath. Ezra worked this ridge in the 50s. He found the seep, the limestone, the thermal properties. He told me this cave could keep a man alive through any winter West Virginia could throw. Rufus pulled his hands from his pockets. They were healing, the purple fading to a mottled yellow, the swelling reduced, the fingers functional if not fully restored. "I could not give you something that would kill you. Whatever you think of me, I could not do that." Marin set the axe on the chopping block. The weight left her arms, her shoulders settling into their resting position. "But you did not stop me from coming up here thinking it was punishment." "No." The words sat between them the way snow sits on a fence, balanced, temporary, waiting for the next shift to dislodge it. Rufus rubbed his healing hands together slowly, the friction producing a dry sound, skin against skin. "I thought you would go back. I thought you would try one night in the cold, feel the wind come through, pack your trunk, walk down to the road, catch the coach east. I thought the cave would do what I could not bring myself to do directly." He stopped rubbing his hands. He looked at them, the damaged fingers, the nails still darkened at their bases. "I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him more than the storm had. The storm had taken heat, circulation, dignity. These 2 words, "I was wrong," took something deeper. They took the structure he had built his identity on, the certainty that he understood this valley, this land, the people in it, the limits of what a woman alone could accomplish with nothing but a cooking pot, a sewing needle, the stubborn refusal to accept the verdict of people who did not know her. He reached into his coat, his hand emerged holding a folded document, not old, not yellowed, new. The paper was white, the ink fresh, the creases sharp. He unfolded it, held it where Marin could see. A deed of transfer. 5 acres on the north face of Briar Ridge, including all structures, improvements, water rights, mineral rights. Transferred from Rufus Telford to Marin Pruitt. Signed, dated, witnessed. 2 signatures at the bottom beside Rufus's: Otis Hadley, Phoebe Galt. The ink was 3 days old. "The land is yours." Properly this time, recorded, legal. Creech can take his grandfather's contract to the county courthouse, but that agreement described the north face in general terms. It never specified the ridge summit, never named the cave, never included the 5 acres I carved out for Josiah's share of the family property. The boundaries are clear enough to hold. The judge in Harper's Mill will see it the same way. Marin looked at the document. The paper trembled slightly in Rufus's hand, not from cold, not from weakness, from the weight of what it represented. A man rewriting the terms of his own cruelty. A man converting a dismissal into a gift, not because the law required it, but because something inside him, something the storm had cracked open the way frost cracks open stone, demanded it. She did not take the paper, not immediately. She looked at Rufus's face. studying it the way she had studied the cave in September, reading its surfaces, measuring its depths, searching for the properties that would determine whether it could be trusted. His eyes met hers. He did not look away. The flinch she had seen in September, the averted gaze when he handed her the first paper, was gone. He was looking at her the way you look at something you have finally learned to see. For what it's worth, his voice dropped. Not to a whisper, but to the register men use when they are saying something they will not repeat, something that must land correctly the first time, because there will be no second attempt. I see you. It was not polished, it was not grand. 3 words, spoken by a man whose vocabulary had never been designed for this kind of statement, whose emotional architecture had no room labeled for admission, recognition, the act of acknowledging that another person's existence matters. The words came out rough, slightly breathless, carrying the grain of his voice the way wood carries the grain of its growth, visible, textured, impossible to fake. Marin reached forward. She took the paper. She folded it along its creases, slid it inside her coat. She gave him one nod, the same nod she had given Otis, measured, sufficient, carrying no excess. Rufus stood for another moment. The transaction was complete, but something remained, a residue of feeling that the document could not contain, that the words "I see you" had released without fully resolving. He looked at the cave entrance, the hearthstones, the thin smoke. He looked at these things the way a man looks at a house he built badly, wishing he could tear it down, start again, knowing he cannot. Then he turned, walked back down the trail, his boot prints joining the dozens of others that now marked the path to Briar Ridge. Ida came the following Sunday. She arrived in the afternoon carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, still warm from the oven, the heat of it visible in the small cloud of steam that rose when she shifted the wrapping. She did not knock. The cave had no door to knock on, only the wooden barrier that Marin swung open during the day, closed at night. Ida stood at the entrance, the bread in her arms, the late light falling across her face at an angle that softened the lines she usually held rigid. Marin was adjusting the kettle hook over the fire, a piece of bent iron she had fashioned from a nail rod, suspending the pot at precisely the height where the heat would warm without scorching. She looked up at Ida, nodded once, returned to the hook. The invitation was in the nod. Ida understood. She stepped inside. They stood together at the entrance as the light changed, the sun dropping behind the western ridge, the shadows of the hemlocks stretching across the snow like dark fingers reaching for the valley below. The bread sat between them on a flat stone, unwrapped, its crust brown, its interior soft. Neither of them had cut it. The bread was not the point. The bread was the vehicle, the object that justified presence, that allowed Ida Telford to stand on a hillside, the woman she had spent 5 months hoping would vanish without needing to name the reason she was there. Ida's hands folded in front of her, her fingers laced together the way they always did when she was composing something, a sentence, a decision, an emotion she wanted to present in a particular shape. Her eyes stayed on the valley below, on the rooftops emerging from the thinning snow, on the thread of smoke from her own chimney rising against the pale sky. I lay awake in this cave the second night. Her voice was quiet, carrying the particular texture of words that have been rehearsed, but not enough to lose their rawness. I listened to the stone, the warmth in it, coming from nowhere I could see, from nothing I could name, just the rock, holding its heat, giving it back. She unfolded her hands, refolded them. I have lived in houses my entire life. I have never known a house that felt the way this place feels. Marin adjusted the kettle hook one final degree. The metal caught the firelight, glowed briefly, settled into its new position. She did not speak. She let Ida's words exist in the cave's quiet air without competition, without the relief of a response that would let Ida move on to the next sentence, without fully inhabiting this one. Ida swallowed. The sound was audible, a click of dry throat, of accumulated silence breaking open. I spent months hoping you would leave. Every morning I looked up at this ridge, expecting to see no smoke, expecting you to finally understand that you did not belong here, that this valley was not your valley, that Josiah's death had ended whatever claim you had on this place, on us. She paused. The hem of her coat moved in the slight breeze that rose from the valley at dusk, a current of cooling air that swept uphill as the ground released its daytime warmth. I did not want to learn you. Learning you would have meant I was wrong about everything I had decided you were. It was easier to wait for you to fail. The silence that followed was long enough for the light to change from amber to gray, the sun dropping below the ridge, the shadows merging until the valley below became a single dark shape, punctuated by points of yellow lamplight appearing in farmhouse windows. I was wrong. The word trembled, not dramatically, not with theatrical quaver. A vibration, barely perceptible, running through the second syllable the way a crack runs through ice, starting small, propagating through the structure, changing the shape of what contains it. Ida's composure, that careful architecture of propriety she maintained, like a woman maintaining a fence, showed its fracture line. Her lips pressed together after the word left them, holding shut as if additional words might escape that she was not prepared to release. Marin reached forward. She adjusted the kettle hook and unnecessary adjustments, the hook already positioned correctly. The gesture was not about the hook. It was about giving her hands something to do while she decided what her voice should carry. She chose carefully. Winter has a way of correcting people. 5 words. No accusation. No absolution. No indication that the past 5 months of isolation, of cold, of silence from the people who should have helped her, that any of it had earned a response larger than this quiet observation about the season's pedagogical tendencies. The words acknowledged what Ida had done without demanding payment. They named the mechanism of change without claiming credit for it. They let Ida's admission stand on its own merits, undiminished by forgiveness, undamaged by resentment. Ida let out a breath. The exhalation carried weight, months of it. The accumulated mass of every morning she had looked up at the ridge expecting empty sky. Every evening she had turned away from the persistent smoke. Every night she had lain in her warm bed, knowing that a quarter-mile uphill a woman slept alone in a cave because Ida had wanted her gone. The breath left her body the way water leaves a cracked vessel, not all at once but in a sustained release, the pressure finally exceeding the container's ability to hold. The invitation came a week later. Not a casual mention, not a suggestion offered with escape routes built in, a formal invitation delivered by Ida herself, who climbed the ridge on a Thursday to extend it in person. Dinner, Saturday evening. The farmhouse, properly. Marin spent Saturday afternoon in the cave, performing no special preparation. She did not own a dinner dress. She did not possess jewelry, perfume, any of the accessories that women in the valley use to mark occasions as distinct from ordinary days. She wore her wool coat, the one Josiah had given her, brushed clean of ash, its buttons polished with a cloth dampened in the mineral water from the seep. She wore her boots scraped free of mud, their leather treated with the rendered fat she used for waterproofing. She looked the way she always looked, plain, functional, assembled for survival, rather than appearance. She did not consider this a deficit. She considered it accurate. She walked down the hill in the late afternoon light. The snow had thinned to patches now, white circles scattered across the brown hillside like coins dropped by a careless hand. The trail was firm underfoot, packed by the dozens of feet that had traveled it in the weeks since the storm. Otis, Phoebe, Rufus, Ida, the unnamed neighbors with their potatoes, their peaches, their blankets. The path she had cut alone in September was now a road, worn wide enough for 2 people walking side by side. The farmhouse appeared through the bare branches of the oaks that lined the lower slope. Smoke rose from the chimney. Lamplight showed in the windows warm yellow, the color of beeswax, the color of evenings spent indoors by people who trust the walls around them. The south door, the same door she had cleared of 8 feet of snow, with a mattock, stood closed, its wood scrubbed clean, a small broom leaning against the frame where someone had swept the step. The door opened before she knocked. Ida stood in the hallway, dressed in a blue cotton dress Marin had not seen before, her hair pinned differently, her face carrying an expression that was neither the practiced smile of September nor the raw vulnerability of the cave. Something between the two, something new. She stepped aside without speaking, her arm extending inward in a gesture of welcome that required no words. The hallway was warm. The hearth at the far end of the kitchen held a strong fire oak, by the smell, seasoned properly, burning clean. The table was set, 3 places, plates, forks, knives, cups. A bowl of stew in the center, steam rising from its surface in slow curls. Bread on a board sliced thick. A dish of butter, pale yellow, marked with the imprint of the mold Ida used for company. Rufus stood near the hearth. He was not stiff, he was not guarded. He stood with one hand resting on the mantel, the other at his side, his body oriented toward the door, toward the sound of it opening. His face, when Marin entered, showed something she had not seen on it before. Ease. Not happiness, not relief, ease. The particular relaxation of a man who has stopped fighting a battle he did not know how to win. There was a chair at the table, not at the edge where a guest might sit, where a tolerated addition might be placed to indicate their provisional status. The chair sat between the other two at the center of the table's long side, flanked by Rufus's place on the left, Ida's on the right. Position of inclusion. A position that declared through the simple geometry of furniture arrangement that the person sitting here was not a visitor, not an obligation, not a problem to be managed through the minimal application of courtesy. They sat. The food was served in the silent efficiency of people who understand that some meals are not about the food. Ida ladled stew. Marin received it with a nod. Bread passed hand to hand from Rufus to Marin, from Marin to Ida, the loaf making its circuit without commentary. The stew was good. Beef, root vegetables, herbs Marin could not identify. She ate slowly, tasting each component, feeling the warmth of a meal prepared by someone else for the first time since Josiah died. The sensation was unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, simply different. The particular warmth that comes from receiving rather than providing. Rufus ate with his eyes on his plate, his movements deliberate, his fork traveling from bowl to mouth in a rhythm that matched the clock ticking on the mantel. Halfway through the meal, he glanced toward the window. Through the bare branches, the dark shape of Briar Ridge was visible against the evening sky, the faint glow of the cave's fire showing as a distant warm point among the cold stars. He looked at it for a long time. He did not speak. The look was enough. It carried the full weight of everything that had happened between September, this moment, the paper, cave, the storm, the mattock, the wolves, the broth, the 5 days of limestone warmth, the deed, the 2 words that had cost him more than any winter. He looked at the distant glow of the fire Marin had built from the thing he had given her, meaning it as an ending, watching it become a beginning. Ida placed her hand on the table, palm down, fingers spread, not reaching for anything, simply resting. Her eyes moved from Rufus to Marin, from Marin to Rufus, measuring the distance between them, not the physical distance across the table, but the other distance, the one that had been closing since the morning Marin appeared at their frozen door, with a mattock in her hand, asking nothing, offering everything. They finished the meal. Marin helped clear the plates, an ordinary act, a domestic gesture so simple it could have been invisible. But in this kitchen, at this table, between these 3 people, it carried the weight of a treaty. Dishes stacked, carried to the basin, water heated, the small machinery of shared labor turning over, producing not just clean plates, but something less tangible, less nameable. The beginning of a pattern, the first repetition of a ritual that, given enough time, might come to feel like family. Marin left at dusk. She walked up the hill in the fading light, the trail firm beneath her boots, the air cooling around her as the sun disappeared. The farmhouse glow fell away behind her. The cave appeared through the trees, the log wall, the hearthstones, the thin line of smoke climbing the still air. At the county courthouse in Harper's Mill, 3 days later, Virgil Creech presented his grandfather's 1,867 agreement to the circuit judge. The document was authentic, yellowed, properly signed, describing a transaction between Samuel Creech, Elias Telford for a parcel on the north face of Briar Ridge. The judge examined it carefully, turning each page, holding the paper near the window where the light could catch the ink. He then examined the deed. Rufus Telford had filed the previous week a transfer of 5 specific acres, precisely surveyed, clearly bounded by creek, ridge summit, a line of marked hemlocks that Rufus had blazed with his own axe in January. The old agreement described the north face in general terms, without survey, without precise acreage, without reference to the ridge summit or the specific parcel where the cave stood. It spoke of the hillside the way men spoke of land in the 1860s in broad gestures, assuming boundaries that were never walked, corners that were never marked, distances that were estimated from horseback rather than measured with chain. The new deed was specific, witnessed, recorded. 2 names at the bottom beside Rufus's: Otis Hadley, Phoebe Galt, each signature carrying the weight of a neighbor who had climbed the hill, stood inside the cave, touched the limestone, seen what a woman alone had built from nothing. The judge ruled for Marin. The 5 acres on Briar Ridge belonged to her, including the cave, the improvements, the water rights, the mineral rights to the limestone that kept her alive. Creech received the bench's ruling without visible emotion. He folded his grandfather's document, placed it in his coat, walked out of the courthouse into the February sun. His claim had been a calculation, an attempt to acquire value that someone else's labor had created. The calculation had failed. He would not return to Briar Ridge. Weeks later, when the snow thinned to patches scattered across the Brown Valley floor like remnants of a conversation no one could quite finish, Marin climbed back to the cave at dusk. The trail was worn smooth now, the path of 100 feet, a passage between two worlds that had once been separated by contempt, now connected by something more durable. She stood at the entrance. The evening air held the first suggestion of spring, not warmth, not yet, but the absence of winter's deepest bite, a softening at the edges of the cold. Below, smoke rose from the Telford farmhouse, from the Hadley farm, from a dozen chimneys along Kettle Creek, each one marking a household that had survived the winter, each thread of smoke climbing the still air with the quiet confidence of something that intends to continue. Marin pressed her palm against the limestone. It held its steady warmth, the same warmth she had felt in September, when she first touched this wall with bleeding fingers, not knowing what she had found. The same warmth that had kept her alive through October, November, December, through the worst storm in 30 years, through the longest night of her life. The same warmth she had shared with the people who had given her this place, expecting it to destroy her. She did not smile. She did not speak. She stood there with her hand on the stone until the last light faded from the valley below, until the first cold edge of night returned, until the stars appeared above Briar Ridge in their ancient pattern, indifferent to the small human story unfolding beneath them, but present for it, the way the earth is present for a seed, not caring whether it grows but providing the conditions in case it does. The cave remained what it had always been: stone, silence, heat given in quiet, held by those willing to learn it, not a punishment, not a gift. A test, the kind that does not announce itself as a test until you have already passed it, until you look back at the thing that was supposed to end you, discover it became the ground you built your life on. Marin turned. She went inside. The fire caught. The warmth gathered in the limestone, patient, certain, asking nothing. The hillside held its quiet, no longer laughing, no longer waiting for her to fail. The valley below moved through its ordinary evening, lamps lit, doors closed, families settling into the small repeated rituals that hold a life together. On Briar Ridge, in a cave that was supposed to be a grave, a woman sat beside a fire she had learned to build from nothing, in a home she had made from contempt, on land that was finally legally, irrevocably hers. The stone held its warmth, so did she.